We are in this book of 2 Corinthians, for those of you who have not been with us. And we only got through, so far, the first 11 verses. We're jumping into verse 12, 13, and 14 here. This is the beginning of what you might call the first section of the body of the letter. So we talked about the introduction, and then we talked about this benediction that he has at the beginning, where he talks about comfort and goes on and on about comfort. And then this is going to be the first kind of section of the body of this letter that he's writing to the 2 Corinthians. And let me give you a little bit more background on what's going on with Paul in the Corinthian church. So he was there. We talked about this, I don't know, maybe 3-4 weeks ago, how Paul spent a year and a half with the church in Corinth. So he's got some time with these people, and he knows them pretty well. One of the things he did there, which we're going to get a lot more into towards the end of the book, is he encouraged the Corinthian church to give a donation to the church in Jerusalem. So when he was with them, they got need of that the church in Jerusalem needed aid financially. And so he was there at the time and rallied them, if you will. We should help them. We should support them. And the Corinthians were like, yes, we'll do it. And he leaves. And he says, you guys prepare the offering, and I'm going to go, because he's on missionary journeys, right? So he's going from city to city to city. He's like, I'm going to go, but you guys spend some time preparing your offering to them, and then when I come back, I'll collect it, and I'll take it back to Jerusalem. So that's the plan. And he's planning on, or at least he tells them when he leaves, I'm going to come back. I'm going to come back and visit you. Now, up to this point, it doesn't seem like Paul has done that. He said he was going to go back and visit them, and up to this point, he hasn't. Now, the people in the church are kind of like, this guy, Paul. And they're attacking him in a whole bunch of different ways. One of the ways they're attacking him is they're saying, look, he said he was going to come back to us, and he hasn't yet. So what gives? Is he wishy-washy in the things that he says? Is he just a liar? Like, what's going on with Paul? He says he's going to do these things, and then he doesn't do them. And so for this first section of the book, that the main body of the book, he's going to address that issue. How come you said you were going to come back to us, and then up to this point you haven't? We're not going to talk about any of that today, because that's probably next week and the week after. But this first few verses here, he's going to give us the principle up front, just like he did in the benediction. Give us the principle of God comforts us so we can comfort others, and then he gives us examples, and then he gives us personal examples in that first section. Now we're starting the next section, and he's given us the principle up front again. And then he's going to go defend himself on why he's said he was going to come back, but he hasn't come back yet. So that's kind of where we are with the Corinthian church and Paul. And we're jumping in here to verse 12. Now the Corinthian church, one more thing. The Corinthian church is all kind of focused on what Paul doesn't have. So what I mean by that is Paul doesn't have a real strong personality when he's with them. He's going to talk about that later on in the book. And they're going to criticize him for that. Paul seems to be under a whole lot of affliction, and the people in the church of Corinth who are against Paul are going to interpret that as he must not be from God, because he's experiencing so much affliction in his life. So he doesn't have the blessing of God, and he doesn't have a very strong personality like we would expect someone who is an apostle to have. He's not overbearing. He's not all the things that the world says this is what a strong person should look like. And then they question they use all that, and then they say something along the lines of probably, maybe he doesn't really have the authority. I mean, he wasn't really originally part of the 12, so maybe he doesn't have this apostolic authority that everybody thinks that he does or that he claims he does. So he's going to defend all these things in this book. He's going to defend his apostolic authority. He's going to defend his personality, why he's not this overbearing, crazy person. In chapter 10, he's going to talk about being gentle and meek and why that's a strength. And then he's going to defend why he didn't choose to go back to them here at the beginning. So there's all kinds of this turmoil, I guess, if you will, where these people who are against him in the church of Corinth are just attacking him on any level that they can get attack in on him. And he's just going to systematically kind of go piece by piece and say, this is where you're wrong and that's where you're wrong and here's what this looks like. This is going to be one of those sections of the book, I don't know if you guys remember at the beginning, when I talked about 2 Corinthians and how it's to a broader audience, but it's also to a very specific church. This is one of those very specific church moments. Okay, Paul made a specific promise to them, I'm going to come back to you, and he hasn't. So as we read through this section here, it's going to be a little bit harder to apply unless you're sitting there thinking, well, I've made promises to people that I haven't kept. Okay, that's a good application. You should do that. But there's more in the text, okay, that you're going to want to take over and think a little bit. This is going to be harder to apply, but if you take the principles and evaluate, you will be able to apply. So, all right, let's read verse 12. This is the beginning of the first section of the body of the letter here, where Paul's going to defend himself on why he has not chosen to come back. And before he starts defending himself, he's going to give this general principle. This is the first 12, 13, and 14 here. Just read verse 12. It says this, "For our boast is this, the testimony of our conscience, that we behaved in the world with simplicity and godly sincerity, not by earthly wisdom, but by the grace of God, and supremely so towards you." So he's being attacked, his character, Paul. His character is being attacked because he said he was going to come back to them, and up to this point of writing this letter, he hasn't. You said you were going to come back, Paul, but you haven't. So what kind of testimony does that give? And so they're attacking him. He must not be an honest person. Okay, here's the principle from the very first verse. The testimony of your own conscience, the witness, that word could be translated. The witness of your own conscience, more important, more telling than what other people are saying. So here's what he's saying to the Corinthian church. I know that you think I might be a liar. I know that you think I might say this and really mean that. I know that you might think that I'm just wishy-washy and I don't know what I really want or what's really from God. Here's what Paul's saying. I know that's what you think, and I know that's what you're saying about me, but my own conscience tells me I'm in the right, that I'm not wishy-washy, that all these things that the Corinthian church wants to say about Paul are not true. So here's one of the things you can take over. How does your conscience testify to you? Does it testify to simplicity? My version says simplicity. Some of yours might say integrity. Some of yours might say holiness. Does your conscience testify to holiness, integrity, and godly sincerity? Or does it testify to something else? That's a better judge for if you're on the right track or not on the right track than whatever it is people are saying around you. And there's a whole lot of voices saying a whole lot of things. This is, can you go home at night and look yourself in the mirror? This is, can you go home at night and lay down to sleep and feel overly burdened by the way you're living life, or you feel at peace? Paul says his boast, and Timothy, because he's writing with him, their boast is the testimony of their conscience, that they've behaved in the world with simplicity. I don't really like the translation simplicity. Holiness is a little bit more applicable. Something that's different than the world. Something that's more pure. In the Greek, it has the context of pure action. That word. And then the next word, godly sincerity. You a lot of times when you see the word God in the Bible, you'll see it capitalized. Here it's not, little g. Because it's an adjective, it's a sincerity that's God-like. It's motives that are God-like, which are pure. So here's what he's saying. We have behaved in the world with pure actions and with pure motive. So the whole package. Not only have what we've been doing towards you, the way we've acted when we're in your presence is pure, but also the way we've intended it. It wasn't selfish. It wasn't for self-gain. It wasn't because we were seeing that this would somehow benefit us. That's what he describes in the next sentence as not by earthly wisdom. This is not because the world says this is how we should have acted towards you. This is not because the world says this is how we were supposed to think towards you or act towards you. This is because God convicted us to do and think and be motivated a certain way, and we did. He uses the motivation here for acting purely and being purely motivated is the grace of God. It says, not by earthly wisdom, but by the grace of God supremely towards you. So them, the Corinthian church, out of anybody else, Paul acted and was motivated this way. He uses this term, it's by the grace of God. Now, as we go through 2 Corinthians, Paul's going to use this term to apply to a myriad of different things. Okay, this one here, the grace of God is the means by which Paul maintains, and Timothy, a pure motivation and pure action. Okay, then in verse 15, we're going to get to it next week. Grace is what saves. Sorry, grace is, that's in chapter 4, chapter 6. In verse 15 here, we'll get to it next week. Grace is having someone's presence. So you can grace somebody by being present with them. In chapter 4, chapter 6, grace is what saves. In chapter 8, the grace of God is a financial gift from the Corinthian church to Jerusalem. In verse 9, the grace of God is a financial gift from God to the church. In chapter 12, the grace of God is what keeps Paul strong. Maybe the crux of the book. My power is made perfect in weakness. My grace is sufficient for you. So he uses this, he kind of wraps up. If you've been around church at all, or if you've not been around church at all, and you walk into church and you hear a bunch of people talking about grace, and they're just throwing grace around for everything. Oh, well, that's the grace of God. That's the grace of God. They must have read probably 2 Corinthians a few times because they just throw it out there like Paul seems to do. He just uses everything's the grace of God, it seems like, in the book of 2 Corinthians. Here, the first example that he gives of that is it's the grace of God that allows you to live in pure action and pure motivation. Now, yeah, I don't know how many of you are like meditators or like deep thinkers or philosophers, or you want to go unpack this stuff, except for Stephanie. I know she likes philosophy. If you want to unpack that, you could probably spend a whole lot of time unpacking how does the grace of God lead to pure motivation and pure action in my life. And that's going to be different for everybody, and it's probably a rabbit trail of what that actually looks like. But if you want to spend time thinking about that in the next week, go for it. So we got Paul, and the whole church of Corinth is focused on what he doesn't have, and he's telling them, this is what I do have. I have a pure conscience. He's kind of like, y'all think I don't have a whole bunch of things in this life. I got struggles, I got trials, but I have a pure conscience. That changes everything. In the first letter Paul wrote to them, and when he was with them, I think he probably tried to get them to understand this. That it doesn't matter what people around you are saying to you. It matters whether you can go home at the end of the day and have a pure conscience or not. But maybe they didn't get it. Or maybe he's talking about other things in his letter in the next verse here. There's something that he was trying to get across to them that they didn't get the first time around. So read verse 14 and then, or read verse 13 and then half of verse 14. It says this, "For we are not writing to you anything other than what you read and understand, and I hope you will fully understand." So something in the first letter, something that Paul said while he was with them, something he's saying they're not fully understanding. We're not sure exactly what that is. It could be this idea that pure conscience, pure motive, pure action, they're not quite getting how powerful this is. First half of verse 14 says, "Just as you did partially understand us. So whatever he's going to put in the rest of the book of 2 Corinthians, he's expecting that by the time we're done, they're going to understand fully what they only partially understood the first time around. So if you're wondering why 2 letters to the Corinthian church, or potentially more, some people who think that there's letters in between these. Why more than 1 letter? Because they didn't understand the first time. They didn't get it. Partially they got it. So now he's writing them again, saying, okay, I'm really hoping by the time we're done with this letter, you're going to have a better understanding, more full understanding. So that's the goal, at least one of the goals of why he's writing this second letter. Here's the hopeful effect. Here's the hopeful effect of the Corinthian church understanding these things more fully. It's the second half of verse 14. It says, that on the day of our Lord Jesus, you will boast of us as we will boast of you. So his goal is to take them from partial understanding, to full understanding. And in the process, create this scenario where on the day that Christ returns, they can stand and mutually boast about one another. Not understand all the accusers, not understand Paul like all the accusers are saying that he is, but understand Paul for who he really is. And that he can understand the Corinthian church so that on the day of Christ they're standing before God and each other saying, this is how Paul helped me. This is how the Corinthian church aided me. This is what Paul did for us. This is what we did for him. That's the hopeful goal. Even in the Greek, it's written in the subjunctive case, which is like the wishing, the wanting, the hoping. That's what he's going for by writing the letter, by telling them these things, and by trying to get them to understand that it's about living with a pure conscience. Now, some of you may be saying, hey, Anthony, this is highly specific, like you said. Okay, he made a promise to them. He didn't keep his promise. What does this have to do with us? How do we, when or how do we reflect ever Paul and Timothy's relationship to a church? Every day? Every day you have a choice with every person you interact with, whether you're going to be pure in action and pure in motive or not. Every day, Paul spent a year and a half with these people. It's a pretty bold claim. Does pure in action and pure in motive mean you can't make any mistakes? Think Paul lived with the Corinthians for a year and a half and never made any mistakes? Doubtful. It probably meant he was willing to do things like apologize. Probably meant he purely wanted their good. Didn't always happen, and he had to go back and make his actions pure by taking responsibility, asking for forgiveness, these sorts of things. I don't believe that when Paul says he was pure in action and motive, that was 100% all the time, because sometimes apologies are the best we can do because we offend without even knowing. If the goal is for Paul to be able to boast about the church on the day of Christ, and for the church to be able to boast about Paul on the day of Christ, here's the last question. Last 2 questions, I guess, if you will. First one, if someone was standing before God, before Jesus, I would hope that'd be like tomorrow or the next day. That'd be awesome. If someone was standing before Jesus on the day of the Lord, can other people boast about you? Not just like stroke your ego, like you happen to be standing next to them and they're standing here and they're like, man, I should probably say something good about this person because this is Jesus and they might get in or might not, whatever. And it has nothing to do with that. But it might feel like that when you're standing there in the moment, like doggone it, if your theology's really bad. Jesus is the only one who gets to say whether you get in or you don't, just so you know. But someone's not just stroking your ego, if they're not just saying, oh, I worship that person. They're so awesome. I have so many nice things to say about them. And when you think about them, you're like, yeah, they just kind of worship me, so it's kind of awkward, and that's not really what I'm going for. That's not the kind of boasting I'm talking about. It's not this like kind of positional authority boasting where this is like your boss, and you're like, if I don't say good things about my boss, then I'll never get a raise or I'll never get to the next position or whatever. So I might as well just be able to boast in my boss because he's my boss. This doesn't have anything to do with positional authority. Can people just boast in you because you're pure in action and pure in motivation? That's the test. If you want to answer the question, on the day of the Lord, will people be able to boast about me to Jesus? The test of that is, are my actions pure? And is my motivation pure? If you can, great. If not, you may want to rethink a few things. Second question. Are you surrounded by people who you can boast about? So Paul wants this mutual kind of boasting. He wants to live and act and be motivated purely when he's dealing with the Corinthian church so that on the day of the Lord, the Corinthian church can stand there and say, Paul was a good influence on us. He helped us. He didn't abuse us. He taught us. He grew us. He was sacrificial towards us. He wants them to be able to say that about him. And as far as he understands, he's living with a pure conscience that he's actually done that. And Timothy too. But he also wants to be able to say that about the people who are surrounding him, the Corinthian church. He wants to be able to stand in front of Jesus and say things like, there's a deacon sitting over here in our room, and I don't know how many of you guys have been up here for how long at Intersect, but for a long time, Robin's been the only deacon sitting in this room advocating for the Intersect service. Standing up and saying, there's this service upstairs that happens, and it's got 30, 40 people up there, 50 people up there, and they're kind of up there, and sometimes they're by themselves, and sometimes the church functions as if things don't exist up there, or there's not a whole group of people that worship up there. And he gets to sit in deacon board meetings and advocate. Are you surrounded by people who you can boast about? Stuart accepted me into, he says, uh-oh. I just did a play. I don't do plays. I know some people are like, you were up on stage, you speak, that's good. No, acting's different. And singing is way different. It's Stuart's realm, world. I just joined in because I knew it would make me uncomfortable and I wanted to grow. And yet, I walked into his world and he treated me like an equal. Where I can go and step into his world and say, God, yeah, do you remember that one time I was in a play at First Baptist Church of Tempe, and I didn't have a clue what I was doing, but there was all these drama and music people, and they were like, you can do it. I needed that. Are you surrounded by people like Sandy Wood, who for me wants nothing more than to see me succeed? Her husband was a pastor for a lot of years. I wish I could get to that point at some point. And she did the pastor's wife thing for a lot of years to be able to give me insight as to how Carissa might be feeling with me doing this whole pastor thing. And up to this point, my interactions with her have been her dedication to not see me make the same mistakes, to just unload a well worth of wisdom that I need, that I don't want to have to learn the hard way. Are you surrounded by people who on the day of the Lord, when you stand before Jesus, you can boast about? That I could actually stand before Jesus and say, I never had anybody support me more than my wife did. It's about being worthy to be boasted about, pure in motive, pure in action. But it's also about living and having a relationship with the church that you can also boast about. Some people have a problem having friends in their life not boast-worthy. And I'm not saying you can only have super pure, holy, righteous friends. But there's a difference, and there may be a line, and it may be different for you than it is for me, between nobody's perfect, but I got some things I could boast about for this person, and this person's actually dragging me away from anything that might be boast-worthy. So it's not just about you learning to be pure in motive and pure in action. It's also about learning to surround yourself with people who you can boast about. Sometimes that's harder for some people. Sometimes people are really, really good at, I can transform my life, I can be all kinds of different people, but they keep and hold on to relationships with people who are just dragging them in a wrong direction. And the difficulty for them is not transforming their own life in that area. It's getting away from people who are not boast-worthy before God. So, 2 questions. Can other people boast about you? Are you surrounded by people who you can boast about? The first question, can other people boast about you? And I told you that the test for maybe answering that question or knowing the answer to that question is, do you have a clean or pure conscience? For those of you who are like, nope. No, I don't. No, I walk around with regrets. I walk around feeling like I'm making the wrong decisions. I'm stuck in addiction, can't get out. And no, I haven't acted or even remotely been motivated to act in a pure way. No, I'm somewhere way off on the other side of the spectrum. If that's you and you're a Christian, if that's you and you're not a Christian, Jesus has forgiveness for you. He has the ability to step into your life and say, my blood paid for that. And I can transform you. And I can help you change. I can help you be different if you want to be different. If you don't want to be different, no reason for Jesus. But if you want to be different, he can help you with that. You can say to him, God, I want you to be the God of my life. You can say to him, God, I want you to help me transition to purity. I understand that there's a difference between right and wrong that you set up, not me, and I want to follow that. You can do that anytime. You can do that in a prayer. You can do that with a friend. You can do that at home in the quietness of your own heart. You can do that here this morning because he's available to us anytime. If you are a Christian and you're saying, I don't have a clean conscience and I don't often act with pure motive, I'm pretty good with pure action, but if you ask me what's really going on and why I'm doing these things, I tell you it's all just selfish. If that's you, then this communion thing that we're about to do becomes really dangerous for you. We haven't talked about, I've read a couple times, but we haven't often talked about necessarily the dangers of approaching the table in an unclean or impure state. But let me read it for you. It's actually in the first book that Paul wrote to the Corinthian church. It's in chapter 11. He's talking about celebrating the Lord's Supper, which we would call this, or communion, might be another name for it. Paul's talking to the Corinthian church and telling them what's proper and what's improper. He says this, "For I received from the Lord what I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took the bread. When he gave thanks, he broke it and said, 'This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' In the same way, he also took the cup after supper, saying, 'This is the cup of the new covenant of my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat the bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes.'" That's why we do this. That's why we do it regularly. As often as you do it, you proclaim the death of the Lord until he comes. We believe that Christ died and that he rose again. This is gluten-free bread, by the way. If you need gluten-free. It's got peanuts in it. Does it still have peanuts in it? Almonds. No peanuts anymore. So if you have peanut allergies, you can go for the gluten-free without feeling like you have to go to the hospital. As often as you do this, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. Here's the next part. Whoever therefore eats the bread and drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty concerning the body and the blood of the Lord. Let a person examine himself then, and so eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For anyone who eats and drinks without discerning the body eats and drinks judgment on himself. And then listen to the result of the judgment. This is why many of you were weak and ill, and some have died. So, we're talking about having a pure conscience. Okay, it's essential to this. This coming and meeting with God. This coming and communing with him. We can't ever live perfect lives, but in 1 John it tells us that if we confess our sins, he's faithful to forgive. That's ongoing relationship management with God. I believe in you. I'm trusting you for salvation, but I still don't live perfectly. So there's a sense that I still need to ask for forgiveness from God for the things that plague my conscience. Those are the things you go and ask for forgiveness again. Not forgiveness for salvation, forgiveness for I want to be right with you again. Because he's like a father to us. We want to be pleasing to him. So, I'm going to pray us to start. If you answered that first question as like, no, I don't have a pure conscience and I don't know what that looks like, you need to take care of that with God in prayer. Whether that's confession or whatever that looks like, submission to, listening to him, to a genuine response to say, I know I have been impure in X, Y, Z. I'd like to change. And he says, good. Forgiven. Then you can come take communion, if that's the response you get. If that's not the response you get from your conscience, if you seem pretty pure, then reflect on this as remembering the death until he returns. Because when he returns, we're going to have a chance maybe to boast about each other. Pray with me, and then when you take a few minutes, you can come up and take. Father, we thank you so much for your Son who makes it possible that we can even commune with you. God, would you teach us to be faithful men and women who are committed to living purely no matter our past. Because we can't go back and change the things we've done. The only thing we can do today is decide we're going to be different, we're going to be changed, and allow your Holy Spirit to fill us and transform us. To live pure in action and motive going forward. Thanks for the hope that Paul had for his relationship to the Corinthian church, that we can look at that today and ask ourselves similar questions. Would anybody boast of us? God, I pray you would transform us into men and women that we can mutually boast about. Would you surround us by people who we can boast about so that we're built up? Would you convict where conviction is necessary, God? Thanks for meeting with us.